You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the Judeo-Christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
Welcome to The Patrick Coffin Show, where we go upstream from culture and strategize about the best practices for repairing the DNA damage done to the country and to the culture that supports it. Today we're going to talk about one of the most controversial, certainly the most emotion-generating topics in and out of the church, and that is homosexuality or same-sex attraction. Although the percentage of people who identify as homosexual or same-sex attracted is about 3% or less, Statistics Canada several years ago found a 1% proportion. However, it affects all of us insofar as it's part of the public conversation. What does the Bible say about homosexual behavior, for example? Why doesn't the Catholic Church use the terms gay or lesbian in her teaching documents? Above all, how can we stay faithful to the gospel and to the historic Christian anthropology while also treating people respectfully and never unjustly discriminating against them? It's not always an easy balance to strike. My guest this episode first came to my attention through an essay he wrote in First Things magazine a couple years ago. I can still remember the impact it had on me, and I've since had the honor of corresponding with him and discussing the whole issue of the Catholic Church's approach to same-sex attraction. Daniel Mattson was featured as well in the award-winning documentary movie, Desire of the Everlasting Hills, which I highly recommend. We'll talk about that as well. And I would say Dan is an unusually articulate ambassador for the Catholic sexual ethic. He's a speaker. He's debated the Church's teaching on homosexuality at Bowling Green State University and has shared his story, his basic testimony across the country in schools and parishes, teen groups, parent groups, with a constant focus on the freedom that comes from chastity and embracing the gospel. His first book is out. Can I say out? Yes. It's called Why I Do Not Call Myself Gay, How I Reclaimed My Sexual Reality and Found Peace, with a magnificent foreword by the great Robert Cardinal Sarah. Dan Mattson, so great to have you aboard, my friend.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Patrick. Good to connect with you again, and so excited about your new show, and glad to be here with you.
Thank you. Now, let me start with a common idea meme that a lot of people watching and listening right now probably have, and that is the unchallenged assumption that you're born that way. Does that cohere with your story? Did you, from an early age, like the age of 2, or I know we've shared your story before, so I know some of the details, but did you ever have that, did you ever go along with that idea that you were born this way and therefore it's just a matter of a gene and that settles the debate?
Well, it's an interesting question because that's really the mantra that's out there right now. Lady Gaga, her theme song is "Born That Way," right? Mm-hmm. I can remember my first attractions to members of the same sex when I was 6 years old. The first grade at Immaculate Heart of Mary School. There was a fellow there who really played a mean kickball. He was a captain of the kickball team, and I envied him, and he seemed more athletic, and that seemed important to me, even at that young age. Mm-hmm. But the idea that the world was divided between gay and straight, that was not in my worldview at that point in time at all. I didn't really begin hearing about gay people until I was maybe about 15 or so, and the idea that I was somehow born this way never connected with me until maybe later in college, because at that point we're talking about the late 80s, early 90s, when the gay rights movement was really becoming active. But even then, I think that I was far enough away from the foundations that have been established now that people are born that way. To me, it never really made all that much sense to me. And nor did it make sense of my experience. Because if I was born that way, why did I have some attractions to women at some points in time and sometimes others? Then it becomes a strange sort of logical conclusion. Well, if you're 90% attracted to men and 10% attracted to women, were you born that way? Mm-hmm. And everywhere on that spectrum, it really it's illogical to me. And of course, there has been no scientific evidence that has been conclusive that people are born that way. There have been twin studies. Well, if there's a gay gene, then there would be 100% concurrence rate of same-sex attraction. And that simply hasn't been the case. 40% do, but that can also go into the nurture-nature question, which I don't really want to delve into. But it's not surprising that twins might experience a higher preponderance of same-sex attraction if they came from the same environment. But to answer your question, I really don't believe that people are born that way. The Catholic Church is very wise in saying that it has a psychological genesis, and I really think that we need to start clinging again to the true nature that we're male and female. That's really who we are born, and then things happen.
You mentioned the 70s and 80s. If you look back at 80s music videos, they're really gay. I mean, there's so much from Madonna and the big-haired metal bands and the kind of Depeche Mode, almost like proto-goth, emo, androgyny David Bowie. That what we would now call a gay vibe seems to me, in the late 70s and 80s, the kind of garish Studio 54,
right?
You know, kind of the hangover of free love from the 60s.
Yeah, well, Paul Darrow, who is in the documentary with me, Desire of the Everlasting Hills, he was an international model. He was very active in that scene. He was at Studio 54. He met all those folks, and he talks about that the cultural people of the time, the popular artists of the time, enjoyed being in the gay culture because it seems so countercultural and subversive and pushing the limits. And that sort of gay sensibility did move into popular culture. That androgyny you talked about, David Bowie kind of played that gender bender game a little bit. And Madonna really enjoyed that sort of, pushing against conventions. And of course, what goes in popular culture will seep into the common imagination. And we're seeing that today with things like Modern Family or the TV shows that we see. It's just this normalization of homosexuality, which has been the main goal of the gay rights movement, to say that this is just as normal as mother and father and children. And the reality of our bodies and the reality of the distilled wisdom of human history tells us that's not the case.
When you say the reality of our bodies, this gets into the topic of natural law. And some people, it just doesn't compute. It sounds so over-philosophical and abstruse and not relatable, not actionable, not practical. But you found a way to get across this idea that our bodies, by their shape, by their nature, and by their complementarity between man and woman, are built, are designed, are made, are for something, and it's not same-sex behavior. How do you approach natural law when you talk to, say, a group of teenagers, high schoolers?
Well, I always, I have to give credit to Dr. Jay Budichevsky for his book On the Meaning of Sex. I had a really jaw-dropping moment when he came and spoke to a conference of the Courage Apostolate, which we could talk a little bit later about. The Courage Apostolate is a ministry for people who live with same-sex attraction and who want to live chaste lives. Well, he came to a conference, and he was talking about the natural law, and he said, he asked the audience, he said, how many of you have a reproductive system? And everyone raised their hands.
Shockingly,
right?
All hands went up.
Including me.
Yeah.
And he said, the answer is none of us have a reproductive system. There's a reproductive system when a man and a woman come together. It's the only part of the corporeal human body that requires two people to be complete and therefore to make sense of it. My body as a man, I'm confronted with the reality, the physicality of my body as a man every day. And as a man, as a sexual creature, my sexuality, my physical sexuality only makes sense in reference to a woman. There's a design and a purpose for the two. And of course, Genesis bears this out. He divided the non-differentiated Adam into two, and it became man and woman. And then once again, they become one flesh. Literally, when a man and woman come into marriage, where it's not sexual, is not hindered by by contraception, they are really one flesh. But the natural law also applies to every area of our lives. I was just at the doctor's office this afternoon, and I picked up People magazine there. I never read it, but there was a story about Ben Affleck, who was just coming out of rehab. Well, why is it that we know that someone who doesn't have control over alcohol needs help?
Yeah.
There's an intuition about the body and what causes us to flourish. If you don't have control over alcohol, you're not going to be happy. This is why we have Weight Watchers, right?
Yeah.
It's why we have Gamblers Anonymous. There's something about having a lack of control over those things that lead away from human flourishing. Mm-hmm. You know, I have glasses. Well, we know that a good eye, is a eye that sees clearly. We can know and look at the design of the body and say, he needs some help. So we provide these lenses. And for me, chastity are corrective lenses that helps me see my body and other people the correct way. And the natural law really helps make sense of human sexuality.
What role did – I'm kind of bouncing around here because there's so many ways I could take what you just said. It was so rich, Dan. What was the role of pornography in your teenage confusions? You said you started at 6. You had kind of a crush on a boy in school and so on. Did that get inflamed by even like straight porn? Did straight pornography kind of begin to initiate that desensitization? Then you needed something more kinky, more strange, more different, more off what you began as being attracted to and ended up in a different place. Is that part of your story?
It is part of my story, and it's a common story of a lot of my friends in Courage as well. Mm-hmm. There tends to be a lot of rewriting of people's biography to say, coming back to what we said earlier, that we were born that way. Mm-hmm. But so many of my friends in Courage, not everyone became addicted to pornography, but a very high percentage of them did. And they were introduced to heterosexual porn and then harder core porn where you're seeing both men and women. And for me, I did not feel very masculine. I didn't feel like and I received a lot of rejection from girls, even in elementary, certainly into junior high and high school. And I started to notice, well, who were women interested in? And they were this absurd caricature of manhood, the buff guy, the athletic guy. And I started longing to be like those people, and that desire became eroticized. So at a certain point, seeing pornography where you see the man and woman together, well, clearly, the pornographic fantasy world, she's enjoying his masculinity. How distorted that is, I see now. Mm-hmm. But to me, this wounded boy that just didn't feel much like a man, these virile men with these amazing bodies became who I thought I needed to be, and then I became sexually drawn to them. This is a common occurrence in men who have same-sex attraction. And then pornography, what have we learned about pornography? It changes the brain. It really changes our whole view. Pornography was a very wounding thing to me in my adolescent sexuality. And eventually I had no attraction to women at all. It was just men.
Is that when you acquired the gay identity tag? At some point you said the words, okay, I am X, I am gay. It's part of my amness, if you will.
Yes. Well, at this point, this is mid to late 20s, and I had no attraction to women at all. I was calling phone sex lines at night. I was so lonely and so isolated. But I always had this dream that I would have a family and be married, but I had no attraction to women. And I went on a research expedition to a strip club, and
someone's got to do the heavy lifting in the research world. Yeah.
Well, I was in college, had done a lot of research, and I thought.
So you went behind enemy lines to a strip club, right?
Well, at this point, I had turned my back on God, really, or close to it, and I had kind of given up my moral qualms. But I clung to this idea. Well, maybe if I saw an in the flesh woman, maybe it would stir some arousal. I sat down. This woman starts sidling over to me. Would you get, can I get you a drink? Sure, I'll get you a drink. And there's no attraction there whatsoever. We started talking about gardening and how much we
backgammon strategy.
Like,
I don't mean to laugh, Dan.
It's funny. It's a funny story. We talked about heirloom vegetables, and she gave me a tip for freezing vegetables. I said, there's no attraction to this woman who wants to give me a lap dance and is offering it. So then I just said, well, I guess I'm gay, And not long after that, I went to Boys Town for the first time. I had a friend who was living there.
Forgive my ignorance. Where's Boys Town?
Boys Town is the LGBT area of Chicago.
Okay.
So Boys Town,
the Castro of Chicago.
The Castro of Chicago, yeah.
Okay.
So I had a friend that I'd gone to high school with who was out and proud, and he said, I'm just going to introduce you to the gay community. Why don't you come on down to Boys Town? Went to some gay clubs, walked around there, and I thought I had found liberty. I thought, well, here I am finally with my people. But it also seemed very strange from the very beginning. It seemed so strange that this community had cordoned itself off from everyone else. So the idea of the gay community as finally being my true home and community, and I think maybe it was because it was like I said, late 20s, maybe early 30s, when this happened. That I had already created a life. I had my job, and I had my community, my family and friends. But it just seems so strange. Why was there this gay enclave?
Yeah, almost like paradoxically, you're all lonely together in a desert island of loneliness, and for a moment, it's sated because you're around like-mindeds. Does that cohere?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you say that, together alone. There was a Huffington Post piece written not long ago that I allude to in my book called it's called Together Alone. This is the title of the article, and then the subtitle is The Epidemic of Gay Loneliness.
Oh, that may have kind of lodged in my gray matter because I just reread the book that I was, by the way, very happy to give a blurb. That's interesting.
Yes,
maybe that saying kind of popped out there.
Well, yes, thanks for the blurb. I do appreciate that. But I'm glad that is Together Alone. And this is why it's so important that we believe that the church's vision, which really understands true community, yes, we are all God's children, right? That's a sign that's out there. But people don't understand the richness of that. We are all God's children. And the beautiful thing about the Catholic Church, which I found, is that it refuses to view me through the lens of a gay man. It says, you are a man. You are not defined by your sexual attractions or your inclinations. The church is very clear in that. And I find in that true freedom to be who I truly am. That's one of the crazy things about the world. Be who you are. Well, I am who I am now that I recognize that I'm a man made in the image and likeness of God, a beloved son of God. That's my identity.
Not the reductionist view that I think Cardinal Sarah says in his foreword to your book, where we're reducing a complex, beautiful human being down to one thing, their sexual behavior. That's one thing I appreciate about the Catholic Church's approach. It's broad and it's deep and it's complex and it's respectful of the mystery of the human person, that no one is the sum of all of their behaviors. We're way more than what we've done in the past.
That's right. And, St. Paul says we must forget what is in the past and always look forward. And how do we do that? Through the mercy of Jesus Christ and in the sacrament of reconciliation. What does Christ say? I do not condemn you. Now go and sin no more. And that's like a loving father with a toddler who just stumbled along the way, and he gladly picks us up and sends us on our way with his blessing. So I find freedom in that. There's no shame associated in the Catholic Church with my attractions to men. The Church loves me and understands in the course of a human life, there are going to be all kinds of varied appetites and inclinations and things like that. But in no way do those ever define a person. Our identity is solely by the grace of God, a beloved son or daughter of God.
Father James Martin has written a lot on homosexuality. He's a regular tweeter. He has a new book out, which I guess providentially came out maybe just before yours, on building bridges. And Father Martin, very rarely, in fact, I can't think of a single, I'm not an avid, regular reader of his material, but I don't see the message of chastity and repentance being front and center. Yes, the church does forbid unjust discrimination. Of course, people, no matter their inclinations, are the same, they've earned the same blood of the same Savior. What's your take on that kind of one-sided approach that wants to build bridges and have compassion, but it seems to be minus the full truth?
Well, there's a beautiful line in the foreword by Cardinal Sarab where he says, "You cannot be more merciful than Jesus." And how true that is.
Than Jesus.
Then Jesus was merciful. And what did he do with everyone? He always called people into communion and conversion. It was the woman at the well is the gospel in miniature. I do not condemn you. Now go and sin no more. And of course, sin. What is sin? It's from that old Latin term for archery. You're missing, if you sin, you're missing the target. You're missing the bullseye. And so I always like to think about sin and the call to conversion through the lens of St. Paul. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Well, what does that mean? When I was a Protestant, I just thought that was God pointing his finger, the angry finger of God. But St. Irenaeus says the glory of God is man fully alive. So when we sin, we're missing the target, this great invitation to this great full life. And Father Martin is just settling in this idea, well, we're going to give you a hug and say we love you and that you're welcome, but we're not going to go deeper in that love and follow the path of Christ himself, because to say go and sin no more might be deemed as offensive. Yeah. That's really doing injury to people, not helping them. And building bridges, I'll just finish up with this quickly. Pope John Paul II, he said that priests are merciful bridge builders. And the way they build a bridge to God is through the sacrament of reconciliation. I wish Father Martin would have written about that. Everyone
who's visited St. Peter's in Rome can see that Pontifex Maximus, great bridge builder. So that's right. The idea of building bridges is inherent in the gospel. Did you ever get to the point of agnosticism? I love the part of your story, Dan, from Desire of the Everlasting Hills, the documentary that you were in, where you drive by the church there and you flip God the bird. Was that when you were sharing that, I was reminded of one of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes. He says this in Surprised by Joy. It's I forget when it came out. It's one of his early memoirs of his conversion. And he said, when I was an atheist, I knew God didn't exist, and I was very angry at him for not existing.
That's interesting.
It's a great paradoxical thing there. So when you're given the God of the universe the finger in your rage and so on, were you a man without faith, or was this your divided conscience kind of boiling?
Well, on an intellectual basis, all this sort of wrestling with my sexuality and faith and the meaning of life and all these things caused me to question those things. Is God really there? And I could never reject the existence of God. I could reject God, and that's what I did. But that the logic of the new atheist just never made sense to me. The contingency of the universe that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about really makes a lot of sense to me. I couldn't deny that God existed, nor could I accept gay revisionist theology, which kind of looks at the Bible and says, all these prohibitions against same-sex sexual relationships are culturally driven, and it's really kind of pathetic theology. And so that did injury to my brain. So I had one choice, either to follow God or to turn my back on him. And I turned my back on him fully with my will, Because I said, well, maybe I'm risking hell, but I felt like I was living in hell already.
So you just read that line from Churchill, when you're going through hell, keep going.
Yeah. Well, then I became the prodigal son. And as I tell in my book and in the film, I did discover that, I say this line in the book. I say, I didn't know the first step to truly living in my Father's house was the first step I took when I left it. Mm-hmm. I had to be the prodigal son, or for me, in my willfulness, I became the prodigal son, and then I was far away, and I realized this is not what it's cracked up to be. I need to go home.
So this is the greatest part of your book, what we're going to talk about now, and that is your return and your finding, as it says in the subtitle, how I reclaimed my sexual reality, not identity, reality, not a tag, as I'll just show the title again with the, there's the name tag there. Your identity, and you found peace. Why did you come back, Dan? I know it's grace. It's maybe hard to articulate, but was it a person? Did you hear something in church? Was it kind of a Christ on the cross moment? Why have you abandoned me? Something happened. What was the turning point?
Well, it was many steps along the way, of course, but the ultimate return to the church, it's beautiful because my godparents were the ones who really were the impetus for that. It's no accident that God chose my godparents for me is to be godparents, because their son lives with same-sex attraction himself. And so they've been involved in this Courage apostolate that we referenced earlier. They've been involved in Encourage, which is an arm for family and friends of those who live with same-sex attraction. Mm-hmm. I had been kind of limping back to church after kind of being the prodigal son and finding that things weren't working out. I started trying to flirt with God a little bit. And I was going to a mega church in a big old converted warehouse, and I had been writing about sexuality, and I started to see sexuality primarily through the lens of suffering. And JP2, in his great apostolic letter on suffering, Salvifici Doloris, he says, we can view suffering as a privation of a good that either we've deprived ourselves or has somehow we have been deprived of. And I began to realize that homosexuality and same-sex attraction is really the lack of something that should have been there. It's not a sexual orientation, it's a sexual disorientation of my God-given orientation. And then I began to say, well, if I am suffering, what is the answer to suffering? Mm-hmm. And in my book, I write that I found a lot of consolation in the Catholic view of redemptive suffering, that it can be used for the good of the world. So I'd been writing about this as a Protestant, thinking about writing a book. My godparents invited me to come to a Courage conference. I had no intention of coming back to the Catholic Church. I sat there in Villanova in their chapel outside of Philadelphia, and was stunned by the beauty of the Mass with the cavalcades of the deacons and the thurible and some bishops and then Cardinal Regali. And I was moved so much by the beauty of this Mass, which I thought was just ritualistic hoo-ha. Mm-hmm. But compared to my mega church where they had a rock band and people were walking around with a Starbucks and flip-flops and shorts, there was something noble about it. And so I tentatively said, well, maybe this isn't so bad. And then as the Mass went on, the rhythm of Lamb of God, have mercy on me. Lamb of God, have mercy on me. And I confess to Almighty God and to my brothers and sisters. There was a beauty in that corporate involvement. And then Cardinal Regali gave a great sermon. And in the course of that homily where he was like Jesus and the woman at the well, and then I heard the men and women of Courage sing in joy and fulfillment, and it was their joy that caused me to come back. So
the faith had you at Hosanna.
Yeah, it really is.
Dan, why don't you use the phrase gay? Why do you think the Catholic anthropology is allergic to the phrase gay, lesbian, LGTB? Because it's not present in the way the Church teaches us. And some agree, some disagree, some want to change that. But why do you think it's sensible for Christians who do live with same-sex attraction to not acquire the I'm a gay Christian or I'm a gay this or that?
Well, the simple answer is that I think they're just lies about the human person. But I will flesh that out. The division of mankind between gay and straight began really with the invention of the words homosexual and heterosexual in the 19th century. This idea of a sexual identity rooted in those attractions of the same sex has never existed in the history of the world. The church has never spoken about that. Even in Greece, where clearly same-sex relationships and love happen all the time, they never changed their view of the division of man between male and female.
And they also didn't redefine marriage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's the distilled wisdom of humanity that we are messing with when we redefine marriage. But those words, suddenly, with the existence of those words, we start thinking and viewing mankind differently. Now, of course, with the words we use, it's the way we start to think. Now, I'll tell you a story. When I was in Pittsburgh, I was speaking to some high school students, and I get these anonymous cards with questions, and one fellow, he said, if I'm attracted to the same sex, does it mean I'm gay? Well, in 2017, it either means he's gay or bisexual. It certainly means he's not straight. So this kid, because he has had perhaps some passing attractions even, and that's the whole history of mankind. The Bible has recognized that man can have varied attractions to all sorts of things and use sexuality in a different way, but it's never been reduced to an identity until now. So I was able to tell that young man, I said, no, you are a beloved son of God like every other man who's ever lived. And I do think these are very reductionist. They limit our identity. They have very little to do with God's plan for human sexuality. Imagine if we were to say of Adam and Eve, that Adam was created in the image and likeness of God as a straight man. Or if you think about Jesus was incarnate, a straight man, or that Mary realized her heterosexual identity by giving birth to Jesus. You see that there's a poverty to limit the fullness and the breadth of what it means to be male and female with these little identities. And then people make up words all the time. So now we have to identify or support people as a pansexual identity, or my favorite one, which is so absurd, is the scoliosexual.
Please enlighten. There are some things that I treasure my ignorance about, but I'm curious about what that you just said is.
Well, a scoliosexual, basically what happened is you had some people online that said, I'm not sure how to describe who I'm attracted to or who I want to be attracted to. And so they said, well, I'm just attracted to queer people. That's who I'm going to choose to be attracted to and who I'm attracted to. So in order to give it a sense of gravitas, they did what people did when they invented homosexual and heterosexual. They looked for a Greek word for queer, and they stumbled upon somewhere in some dictionary scolio, which really means queer or curvature, which is we get scoliosis from this.
Yeah.
So now they said, well, I'm a scoliosexual. So with a new word, we have a new sexual identity, and we have to supposedly say that the scoliosexual, if you follow the logic of gay and straight and bisexual and pansexual, you have to say, well, now the scoliosexual is a distinct sexual minority who is entitled to certain rights and benefits because he's born that way. It really is absurd.
And that ties closely to another topic I've had and will in the future, and that is the passage of Bill C-16 in Canada, which will make it a crime to misgender someone. So if someone identifies as non-binary and they demand that you call them one of these ever-proliferating wacky pronouns, it becomes a crime under Canadian federal law. And this is where it's not just a battle of ideas. This is where the legal system is now on the side of those who 5-10 years ago, Dan, this would be seen as an Onion parody, except that it's all unfolding in the real world.
Right. Well, speaking of a parody, there is a brilliant, very prescient scene in Monty Python's The Life of Brian, and where they're sitting in this arena and
on the steps.
On the steps, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Gloria. Yeah, tell the story. It's great.
Yeah, so I can't remember the names of all the characters, but they're in this revolutionary movement, and there's 3 men and 1 woman, and one man, he says, part of the revolutionary movement, I want to be called a woman. And John Cleese's character, but you're not a woman. Why, I should have the right to say that I am a woman.
Yeah.
And Monty Python says, well, you cannot have a baby. Well, I should have the right to have a mother. Be a mother.
Yeah.
And it's just absurd, and it's a parody, but now it's being enacted in laws.
Now it's maybe even more. Even showing that would be bigoted and hateful, because you're mocking a sacred. You're making a cheeseburger out of sacred cow.
Right. And this is where we have to, of course, we are concerned primarily with the city of God, right? We are concerned with heaven, but we are in this earth for a time, and we're called to be salt and light, and we should be using the political tools at our disposal in a democratic society to push against this. We have to really reclaim reality, and if Christians won't do it, and other people of goodwill won't do it, what is going to happen to our society, and what will happen to our children? This is the grave danger. Now we're having drag queens going into public schools reading children's stories. And that's really kind of indoctrination. And I find it very reprehensible that such things are happening.
Public and Catholic. The traditionally or historically Catholic University of San Diego has an annual drag ball. And
right.
So it's the new normal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so what do? We have to trust in God. I don't like the idea of us, saying, well, it's inevitable. I think we have to, in our own way, proclaim the truth to those who will hear it. And that's why I've written the book. I know a lot of people think I'm crazy, right? I'm okay with that, because this is really good news. The true nature of our identity as man and woman is what the world desperately needs.
I'm sure that you have heard or will hear this, that this book is one big psychological working out of your own self-hatred.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
I've been called, well, he's just internally homophobic, and he must really hate himself, and he's filled with so much Catholic guilt or whatever. It's just really patronizing and to me insulting, and I just can't even take those people seriously. It's really a failure of imagination to imagine that somebody can actually find peace and fulfillment in the Catholic Church. Imagine that.
Yeah, without genital interaction even.
Right.
Crazy.
Right.
Dan, have you ever met a gay man in your life that had a good, salient, affectionate relationship with his father? That's a very pivotal question, because really what we're looking for is the love of the Father. And people don't. There are certain people that want to say that, if you start talking about the love of the Father, then you are engaged in Freudian psychobabble, and that's archaic and has nothing to do with reality. But I do find it to be the case that there is oftentimes a distance in that relationship with the Father. And it's not necessarily because the Father is a certain way. It's often the perception of the Son. That's key, isn't it? The perception of the Son.
Yeah.
The dad could be doing the best he can. He's
Yes.
he's out of town a lot or whatever. But the Son's perception of it. And by the way, speaking of not reducing this, it's not ever one thing. There's no magic bullet that explains a mystery like same-sex attraction. So I'm not trying to put it in one box.
Yeah, and certainly there are cases where somebody would have same-sex attraction, and they would say they have this great relationship with their father, and I'm not going to doubt that. Yeah. But we live in a cause and effect world, and nothing just happens on its own. Mm-hmm. And this is why I really think that the church is wise in talking about there being a psychological genesis. This is in the realm of the psyche. Something comes along the way that disturbs us. Oftentimes, this is one thing, there's a much higher rate of early young sexual encounters amongst men and women with same-sex attraction. It's either 1 in 6 times more or 1 in 7 times more. And I write about that in the book, that was really this encounter with a neighborhood boy I felt like was a boulder dropped in the stream of my psychosexual development. And it's a tragedy when people for political and ideological means, say that that's just hogwash. I can see the wounds clearly in my life that led to same-sex attraction. It was at times a distant father and other men who kind of were scary and intimidating at times. The rejection from women, pornography, my own sort of doubts about my own masculinity. It's all there. Mm-hmm. It's all there.
I want to close with, if we can, Dan, talk to parents listening right now whose son or daughter has come out and made the big grand announcement, I'm gay, and mm-hmm. everyone doesn't want to talk about the 600-pound elephant in the room, which is maybe you're not. Maybe this is a phase. Maybe this is something that you need to look at from a much deeper point of view. But the idea that finger pointing or moralizing or catechism thumping is going to solve anything, obviously fallacious, doesn't work.
Right.
In your experience, is it valid to say, and from the point of view of encourage too, that your loved one who has made this announcement is really trying to be happy? They're not trying to rebel. They're not trying, hey, how can I offend God and my parents? I know, I'll just say I'm gay. That this is a sincere desire to repair, to amend, to find liberation from something. In other words, they're after what they think will make them happy, correct?
Right, of course. That guides every choice we've ever made, I think, is we are always in pursuit of happiness and know that we're made for happiness. My advice to parents when a son or daughter comes out is, above all else, affirm them in your love for them, unconditional love. Now, that doesn't mean supporting, right? Doesn't matter. We're going to love you regardless. Mm-hmm. But then it also needs to be an invitation to go deeper into relationship with them and say, tell me what this has been like. I did not know. Tell me about the painful moments in your life. Let's not even talk about the morality of it right now. You know I'm Catholic. I believe in the Catholic Church. I care about you. I want to know about your life. And the deepest thing is to stay in relationship and love them unconditionally. You need to make boundaries very carefully and discreetly. And this is why encourage can help. And then to educate yourself in this whole area to find out more about it. CourageRC.net has a list of great resources for parents. There are Encourage chapters throughout the country. There aren't enough, unfortunately. We're still working on that. But coming to a Courage conference can help, where you can really find support and learn what really works and helps. Now, for a younger boy of 12, 13, or a younger girl, 12, 13, 14, that's where parents can really be involved and help intervene and try to find these wounds that are going to help there. And to help a child say, your feelings don't necessarily define you. Let's find out what defines you. What aren't the things that interest you what really define you? And journey alongside them.
Sure. I'm glad you gave the website for Courage, CourageRC.net. I think it also works .com.
Yes, both.
And you can connect with Dan Mattson at his blog, although I think it might be, you've been a little spotty recently. I have a feeling it's going to roar back to life, just my prediction, Dan. letterstochristopher.wordpress.com. And if you go to patrickcoffin.media, I'm going to have in my show notes links to the blog, but also a link to get this magnificent book. It's a memoir. It's educational. There's no, hey, look at that. Why I Don't Call Myself Gay, How I Reclaimed My Sexual Reality and Found Peace. If you're listening on YouTube and watching, click subscribe. I'd love to keep in touch. Daniel Mattson, thanks for being a gift. I'm a big fan of the book, and I learn a ton every time I talk to you. So thank you, sir.
Well, thanks, and thanks for your support of not only my book, I appreciate the endorsement, but also of the Courage Apostolate, and really getting this good news out there means a lot to all of us in Courage. So thank you.
Amen. Keep it up, Dan. We'll be in good touch, all right?
All right, sounds good, Patrick.
Okay. This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?